What's going on, Magic Nerds? Steven here, coming at you with some better magic, the magic talk show where we talk about playing better magic. Have you ever wondered how Yorion decks seem to always have something to do with their mana? How they get to spend all of their mana every turn of the game? They're 80 cards. I don't know about you, but back in my day, if you played more than 60, you were crazy. I mean, it was just the way you built decks. You never go past 60 cards because it decreases your consistency a lot. And when you're trying to win a Magic tournament, that's the last thing you want to do. But I guess the times are changing. I mean, they do keep printing more and more powerful cards in each set. So back in the day, you used to be concerned about the power level of every card in your deck. So if you played more cards, that meant that you were adding worse cards to your deck that you were potentially going to draw. That's a little bit different now, I guess. Does it really even matter what cards you draw anymore? I mean, at that point, playing 80 cards is the same as playing 60, right? You have the random chance of drawing lands or spells, and your land to spell ratio is going to be consistent, right? Wrong. Let's talk real quick about deck thinning. Allow me to demonstrate by comparing a 60 card deck with an 80 card deck, both of which have the same land to spell ratio. For example, in a Yorion deck, or I guess pre-Yorion, the ramp deck of choice was Bant Uro. Now, the old Bant Uro decks used to run about 27 lands. If you do the math, 27 out of 60 is 45%. Now take the current Yorion builds, which play 80 cards with 36 lands. That is also 45%. This land to spell ratio gives you an average starting hand with 3 lands and 4 spells. So let's take that as our example starting hand in all of our exercises. In a 60 card deck with 7 cards in hand, 3 of which are lands, that leaves you with a 53 card library with 24 lands left. 45.3% is lands. Now, in the case of flooding, every time you draw a card, let's pretend that you consecutively draw land after land after land off the top. Every time you draw a card, it's a land. So you draw your 4th land, you end up with 23 lands left in your deck out of the 52 cards left. This reduces your land to spell ratio down to 44.2%. Take the difference of these percentages and you get every time you pull a land out of your deck, you're reducing your odds of drawing another land by 1.1%. Now looking at an 80 card deck, we have the same scenario. Start with 7 cards in your hand, 3 of which are lands. That leaves you with 33 lands in your deck out of a 73 card library, 45.2%. You draw a card and it's a land. So now you have 32 cards in your library that are lands and 72 cards total, 44.4%. Take the difference of those two percentages and you're left with 0.8% difference after thinning your deck by 1 land. These differences might not seem very large, 0.3% difference between 60 cards and 80 cards, but in the long run, over the course of a game, it dramatically affects the way that the game plays out. So at this point, you're probably wondering which one is better. One of them is a higher percentage and the other one's a lower percentage, but I'm not a math whiz, so well, in the case of aiming for the best deck consistency in preparation for a tournament, you're actually going to want the higher percentage. And here's why. Every time that you draw a card, you affect what your odds are of drawing the opposite card in a future turn. So if you're drawing tons of lands and every time you draw a land, you're affecting your statistics by 1% instead of 0.8%. You're eventually going to get to a point where you're drawing too many lands and you're going to be happy that your statistics are changing by so much. You kind of have to think of it like every land you draw, you're reducing your odds of drawing more lands in the future. And every spell you draw, you're reducing your odds of drawing more spells as well, which allows you to then find your 3rd land drop on time. This kind of self-correcting nature of a deck of cards kind of is really what you're striving for by reducing the number of cards in your deck. For example, with an 80 card deck, you could start with a hand of 5 lands, and your deck could be totally punishing to you, and since every time you draw a land, you're reducing your odds less than if you had a 60 card deck, you're more likely to draw more lands continuing through the game, and all of a sudden you're going to end up drawing 8 lands, nothing to do, and you're just going to be dead on board. To take this concept a step further, we can apply it to limited decks as well. So with a 40 card deck, 45% land count is equivalent to playing 18 lands. So with 18 lands, your starting hand of 7 cards would also consist of 3 lands. At this point, 15 of your 33 cards remaining in your deck are all lands, which leaves you with 45.5% land count. After one draw step, you reduce the number of lands in your deck to 14 out of 32, 43.8%. Take the difference of these two percentages and you end up with a 1.7% difference from thinning your limited deck. This is why it's even more important to get the correct land count in your limited deck than it is in your constructed deck. Because if you're off by only 1 land, you're changing your percentages by nearly 2%, which is actually quite a lot. Now, one last thing I want to touch on before moving on from this topic is the fact that whether you're starting with 80 cards, 60 cards, or 40 cards, your percentages and your influence on your deck changes throughout the entire game. So if you started with an 80 card deck, eventually there's going to be a turn where you only have 60 cards left in your deck, and you're going to experience those 1.1% changes. Likewise, you'll eventually get down to the point where you've got 33 cards left in your deck, and you're going to be experiencing those 1.7% changes. This variable change of percentages is what makes statistics so incredibly important in Magic. Since we're on the topic of statistics, let's talk about the cycling deck now. The current cycling deck in Standard is quite possibly one of the most interesting archetypes to ever emerge in tournament Magic play. This is due to the fact that only one card in the entire deck does not have cycling, and that is Zenith Flare. Add to that the fact that you play 16 creatures that all benefit from you cycling. So in a way, this is kind of just the most consistent deck that has ever been in Magic. Currently, these cycling decks only play 18 lands in their 60 card deck, which is crazy low for a Standard deck. On average, your starting hand is going to show you 2 lands, and if you're unlucky, you'll see 1 land or 0 lands pretty often. Now, from a statistics standpoint, this deck is actually very intriguing because of the way that cycling affects the math. See, when you're building a deck, you can often count a cycling card as not actually a card in your deck. So if you removed all the cycling cards from this deck, you would be left with 4 Zenith Flare and 18 lands, a 22 card deck. If we just replaced cycling 1 on all of these cards with cycling 0, you literally would have a 22 card deck. At that point, you'd probably even want to reduce the number of lands you play down to, I don't know, something ridiculous like 6. It would become this crazy kind of deck where turn 1 Flourishing Fox would just be a 10-10. Now, part of the nuances of this cycling deck really boils down to the fact that every time you cycle a spell away, you're more likely to eventually pick up too many lands in your hand. For example, if you start with 1 land and 6 cycling spells, you're eventually going to draw more lands, right? I mean, you're going to start by playing your land, you're going to cycle a spell, and you're either going to draw a spell or a land. Now, if you draw a spell, it's going to have cycling, so you're going to get to do it again. And at that point, you're again faced with the odds of you're either going to draw a spell or a land. Do this enough times, and you will eventually draw a full grip of lands. So far, the builders of this deck have coped with this fact by just playing less lands. As you see, they play 18 lands, so after cycling so many times, their odds of drawing those lands becomes greater, up until the point where the statistic is as if they had been playing 26 lands all along. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if people started incorporating cathartic reunions into this deck just so that once they get to a point where they flood out too much, they have a way to discard the lands that they draw so that they can draw into more cycling cards and thus continue to cycle through the rest of the deck. At that point, it's almost like you can't flood with the cycling deck. Come to think of it, I've never seen a Yorion deck flood out either. They've always had a grip full of 4 to 7 cards in hand, and they've always had something to do with all of their mana, except for a very slim number of games. It's almost like the power creep displayed in all the cards in the past year and a half. Uro, Oko, Teferi, Narset. Yeah, we don't need to hear them all. They've created this environment where it's almost like impossible to run out of things to do with your mana. It's like Magic has entered a space where it's impossible to flood. And that kind of leads us to the next question. Are we playing enough lands? Do we need to be playing more so that we can more consistently hit all of our land drops and more consistently be able to cast all of our spells? We see all these Yorion decks that are playing 36 lands, a 45% land to spell ratio. This ratio is traditionally much higher than it has been in Magic's past. So my question is, how high do we push it? Should we be playing a 50% ratio? Yes, I'm talking about playing 40 lands in your 80 card deck, or even 30 lands in your 60 card decks. Has power creep pushed us into a position where a 50% land to spell ratio is actually correct? Nah, probably not. I might have gone a little bit off the rails on this one. Well guys, it looks like we're out of time. Active player, finish your turn. You have 5 additional turns to hit the like and subscribe button down below, and I'll see you in the next video.